A billionaire screamed at a young black waitress in front of an entire restaurant, insulted her, humiliated her, and demanded she be fired. But what she said next, it didn't just silence the room, it went viral and changed her life forever. This is the moment one powerful sentence turned the tables and shocked the world. The restaurant was buzzing with wealthy customers. Every table was occupied by people who lived life in excess, business magnates, politicians, and influencers. The sound of cutlery tapping against fine china blended with soft jazz playing from the live band near the bar. Waiters moved swiftly and silently like shadows, balancing silver trays and wine bottles, their uniforms pressed to perfection. Crystal glasses clinked softly, laughter rippled through the air, and the scent of imported wine and aged steak filled the grand hall. Gold trim lined the walls, and massive marble columns held up a ceiling painted with Renaissance-inspired artwork. Wait lists for a table here could stretch for months. This was the kind of place where being seen mattered more than the meal itself, where names were currency and silence was sold to those who could afford it. Then the shouting started. "Do you know who I am? I don't wait for service." The man's voice sliced through the elegant calm like a knife. It wasn't just loud, it was demanding, boiling with entitlement. Conversations died instantly. Forks froze midair. Even the pianist paused with a wrong note. Heads turned, cautiously, one by one, to see the source of the commotion. At table 7 stood a man who needed no introduction to anyone in the room, Harold Kensington. He was one of those billionaires whose face rarely showed up in interviews, but whose name echoed across industries, from real estate and tech to fashion and media. He had a reputation that preceded him, not for kindness or generosity, but for dominance and pride. His empire was built on ruthless decisions and iron control. He sat at the center of the room like a king holding court, his expensive suit stretched across his broad shoulders, a gold cufflink flashing with every aggressive hand gesture. His phone sat on the table next to a plate he hadn't touched, except to push it away in disdain. Beside him, a blonde woman in diamonds lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. Across from him stood a young black waitress named Elena. No more than 23, she had the quiet grace of someone used to holding everything together. Her black apron was spotless, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her expression carefully composed. A notepad rested in her hand, still open to the last order she'd written. She had just approached his table to politely explain that the kitchen was behind on his special request. A dry-aged ribeye, extra rare, no pepper. She had barely finished her first sentence when he erupted. He leaned forward now, face flushed with rage, voice dripping venom. "You people should be cleaning my shoes, not serving me food." For a split second, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. A woman at the next table covered her mouth in shock. A man across the room furrowed his brow and looked away. A couple near the fireplace stopped chewing, their eyes wide in disbelief. The jazz music faded into the background, as if even the instruments were stunned. Elena didn't move. No tears welled up in her eyes. No anger twisted her face. No embarrassment rushed to redden her cheeks. She stood as if made of stone, absorbing the cruelty without letting it penetrate. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her shoulders didn't slump. She simply looked at him, directly, calmly, unflinchingly. In that moment, there was something about her that shifted the energy in the room. Her eyes weren't defiant, but they were powerful. She wasn't reacting, she was witnessing. She held his gaze, watching as he waited for a response. He wanted her to shrink, to tremble, to apologize, to give him something to feed the superiority he so desperately needed to assert. But she gave him none of it. And then she smiled. Not sarcastically, not bitterly. It wasn't the smile of someone hiding pain or faking strength. It was the quiet, grounded smile of someone who had seen this before. Someone who had heard worse, dealt with worse, and walked through worse, and still came out whole. It wasn't the smile Harold expected, and in a way, that shook him more than if she had yelled back. The room remained silent, all eyes watching this silent exchange. No one dared speak. The usual rules of the restaurant, discretion, detachment, distance, were shattered. For many in the room, this was more than awkward. It was uncomfortable in a way that left a mark. Because watching someone abuse their power and get away with it wasn't new. But watching someone quietly absorb that hate, then rise above it without a single word? That was something else entirely. Elena didn't need to shout to make herself heard. She didn't need to cry to show how deeply his words cut. Her stillness was louder than any response. And that smile? It wasn't just a reaction. It was a mirror. It forced Harold to look at himself for the first time, not through the lens of his wealth, or his status, or the fear he instilled in others, but through the steady, unflinching eyes of someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and still chose grace. He opened his mouth, perhaps to say something more, but no words came. For once, Harold Kensington had nothing to say. Elena stood there for a moment longer, then gently nodded, her voice as steady as her stance. "Your meal will be out shortly, sir." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly felt very small, and one billionaire who, for the first time, realized he couldn't by the kind of strength she just displayed. The room went silent. A thick, suffocating silence. Waiters froze in mid-step, silver trays balanced awkwardly in the air. Customers paused with forks halfway to their mouths, food forgotten. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even a jazz band, sensing the tension, faded into near silence, their instruments now no louder than a whisper. All eyes were on Elena. Every single person in that luxurious restaurant turned their attention to the young black waitress standing tall at table 7. The air felt dense, heavy with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Everyone was waiting to see what she would do. Was she going to cry? Run? Shout back? Would she fold under the pressure of a man known for crushing anyone who crossed him? But Elena didn't move. She didn't flinch. She stood with a stillness that was almost regal, like someone who had already been through worse and had learned how to carry herself with grace in storms much darker than this one. She was only 23, but her eyes, clear, steady, held stories of struggle far older. Elena had been through it all, losing her parents in a tragic accident 2 years ago, taking full responsibility for her 12-year-old brother, juggling 2 jobs, barely sleeping between night shifts and college classes. She'd known what it felt like to stretch a dollar to its last thread. She'd learned how to smile at customers who snapped their fingers at her. She'd seen the condescension in the eyes of those who thought an apron meant inferiority. But none of that had broken her. And Harold Kensington? He wasn't going to, either. Still, no one, not even Elena herself, could have predicted what she'd say next. She took one small step forward, just enough to close the space between them, so her words couldn't be ignored. And in a voice that was calm, clear, and unshakably poised, she said, "You yelling at me says more about your heart than my worth." It wasn't just a comeback. It wasn't meant to wound or win applause. It was truth, delivered so simply, so quietly, that it echoed louder than any scream ever could. And for a heartbeat, the entire restaurant remained frozen. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath. It was like the world paused to absorb what had just been spoken. Harold blinked. His face, once puffed with arrogance, now twitched in confusion. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. It was as if he didn't understand what had just happened, how someone he thought beneath him had responded not with submission, but with dignity. He had thrown hate like a spear. She had returned it like a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw something ugly, something even he wasn't prepared to face. Then, quietly, from a corner table near the bar, came the sound of a single clap. Just one. Measured. Deliberate. Heads turned. A man in his 50s, dressed in a gray suit, slowly brought his hands together again. Clap. Then again. Clap. Clap. A woman near the fireplace joined him. Then another couple behind table 3. Soon, the room filled with applause, soft at first, then louder. Waiters clapped. Customers clapped. Even the pianist struck a few hopeful chords, as if unsure whether this was real. It wasn't staged. It wasn't forced. It was admiration, respect, something genuine born from watching someone stand their ground, not with violence or fury, but with an unshakable sense of self. And Elena? She didn't bow. She didn't tear up. She simply nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, then turned to leave the table. But before she could walk away, Harold slammed his hand on the table. "Enough," he bellowed. The applause stopped instantly, replaced by a cold tension once more. He stood up so fast his chair screeched against the marble floor. "This is ridiculous. I will not be humiliated by some waitress," he growled, pointing a shaking finger at Elena. "Fire her. Now." The manager, Colin, had been watching the entire exchange from the shadows near the bar. A kind man in his early 40s, he had always respected Elena's work ethic. She showed up early, stayed late, took double shifts without complaint. Now he found himself walking toward the commotion, eyes cautious. "Sir, I don't believe she said anything wrong," he began. Harold turned on him like a predator. "Then maybe you want to lose your job too?" Before Colin could answer, another voice entered the conversation. This one calm, older, more authoritative. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the voice said. It came from a man who had started the applause earlier, the one in the gray suit. He now stood, adjusting his cuffs with quiet confidence. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" Harold spat, already irritated beyond control. The man smiled gently and replied, "Someone who owns 30% of your failing tech company, and someone who believes in treating people like human beings." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was Gerald Mason, a tech investor and philanthropist known for his integrity and low-key business style. Unlike Harold, Gerald avoided headlines unless they were about charity or innovation. But in every boardroom that mattered, his voice held weight. Harold's posture faltered for the first time. "Mr. Mason, I didn't realize you were." Gerald raised a hand to cut him off. "Spare me the performance." He turned to Elena. "That was the most poised, intelligent thing I've heard in years. What's your name?" "Elena, sir." "Well, Elena," he said, pulling out a sleek business card from his coat pocket. "When you're ready to work somewhere that values who you are, not just what you do, give me a call." Elena accepted the card, stunned but composed. The applause resumed, softer now, but filled with admiration. As she walked away from the table, Harold sank back into his seat, defeated, not by a competitor or a crisis, but by a sentence he'd never see coming. And that sentence? It would go viral that night, shared across millions of phones, reposted by celebrities, turned into quote graphics, printed on T-shirts, spoken in classrooms. "You yelling at me says more about your heart than my worth." 7 words that shattered arrogance and elevated a voice the world didn't know it needed. 7 words that prove strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it just stands still and speaks truth. The applause didn't last long because Harold snapped. His pride had been bruised, and for a man like Harold Kensington, that was unforgivable. He had built an empire through control, intimidation, and dominance. No one ever challenged him, and when they did, he crushed them. He grabbed his white linen napkin and slammed it onto the table. Dishes rattled. Wine glasses trembled. "Fire her!" he shouted, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Fire her! Right now!" Gasps rippled across the room. The applause stopped instantly, sucked out of the space like air from a vacuum. The energy flipped again, cheers replaced by tension, admiration replaced by dread. A few people looked toward the entrance, as if debating whether to stay or leave. Others stared down at their plates, suddenly unsure how to act. The manager, Colin, rushed to Harold's table. His face glistened with sweat. His hands wrung together nervously. He had dealt with difficult customers before, even a few celebrities, but this was Harold Kensington, a man with deep pockets and deeper connections. The kind of man who could destroy a business with one phone call, or fund it with a casual nod. "Mr. Kensington, please, let's talk privately," Colin stammered, trying to calm him. "I said fire her." Harold's voice thundered again, his face red with rage. He jabbed a finger toward Elena, who had calmly stepped aside and was now standing near a pillar, expression composed but alert. "I don't care if she's the Queen of England, she's done here. You think you can embarrass me in front of a room full of people and still keep a job? She's gone. Now." Colin hesitated. Sweat ran down his temples. His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked toward Elena, then back to Harold. His voice caught in his throat. This was the kind of decision that could cost him his own position. But what was the cost of staying silent? Then, from the back of the room, Another voice broke through. It was calm, yet firm. Low, yet commanding. Like the steady voice of someone who didn't raise it unless he meant every word. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The room turned again. A second time, all eyes shifted, this time to the tall man who had stood up near the corner booth, beside a half-finished glass of bourbon and a briefcase resting neatly by his seat. He was in his early 60s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a navy blue suit that fit with quiet elegance. His presence wasn't flashy. It was intentional, measured. A man who didn't need to shout to be heard. Harold spun around, annoyed. "And who the hell are you?" The man didn't flinch. He took a few slow steps forward, then straightened his cuffs. He smiled slightly and said, "Someone who just bought 30% of your company, and someone who still believes in treating people with respect." A hush swept over the room. Mouths fell open. Phones were discreetly lifted under tables. Even Harold, so used to being the most powerful man in any room, stared, stunned. "You what?" he asked, the anger in his voice suddenly replaced with uncertainty. The man extended his hand calmly. "Gerald Mason. Redwood Capital." More whispers spread. Redwood Capital. Everyone knew that name. It was one of the most respected investment firms in Silicon Valley. They didn't just throw money around, they reshaped industries. When Gerald Mason invested in something, the world paid attention. Harold's eyes narrowed, brain spinning as he did the math. It couldn't be, but it was. "You're the one who just invested in Stratos AI?" Harold asked, his voice low now. Gerald nodded. "Correct. And as of this morning, I own just under a third of your firm's tech portfolio." Harold's mouth twitched. He didn't know whether to panic or scream. "But don't worry," Gerald added, still polite. "I'm not here to discuss numbers. I'm here to tell you you're making a very poor decision." He turned toward Elena, who was still standing quietly by the pillar, watching everything unfold like someone caught in a storm she didn't ask for. Gerald walked over to her. He didn't just look at her, he saw her. The weight she carried, the restraint she'd shown, the dignity she held in a moment when most people would have broken. He extended his hand. "You handled that with more grace than most CEOs I know," he said sincerely. Elena blinked, surprised. Slowly, she reached out and shook his hand. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. "I'm not sir tonight," Gerald chuckled. "I'm just someone lucky enough to witness courage in its rawest form." Harold was still standing, stuck in disbelief. His whole life had been about leverage, but in that moment he had none. Gerald turned back to him. "You know," he said, "when I decided to invest in Stratos, it wasn't just about numbers. It was about leadership, vision, culture. But if this is the kind of leadership at the top..." He let the sentence hang in the air. Harold stepped forward, almost pleading now. "It was a misunderstanding. She insulted me." "No," Gerald interrupted calmly. "She told you the truth. You just weren't used to hearing it from someone who didn't wear a tie." The silence was back, this time heavier for Harold than anyone else. Gerald reached in his coat and pulled out a business card. He handed it to Elena. "If you ever decide you're ready to leave this place," he said, "call me. I don't care what job you start in. We'll find one that matches your fire." Elena stared at the card. Redwood Capital. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Thank you," she said again. Gerald gave her a gentle nod, then turned and headed back to his table. As he walked, people began clapping again. Not wildly this time, but with quiet purpose. Some stood. Others nodded toward Elena as they applauded, not just for her words, but for the way she carried them. Harold? He sat back down, defeated. His empire was intact, but his pride was in pieces. For once, the most powerful man in the room wasn't the billionaire. It was the waitress who dared to speak with grace, and the investor who listened. That night, Elena didn't lose her job. No official meeting was called. No pink slip was handed over. The manager simply pulled her aside, his face pale, but his voice calm. "We're proud of how you handled yourself," he said quietly. "No one here is letting that man decide your future." But the real turning point wasn't in that moment. It came later that evening, long after the last plate had been cleared and the last customer had gone home. Elena sat alone in the break room, her apron folded neatly on the table, her hands still trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from everything that had unfolded. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She just sat there, trying to process what had happened. And then her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "This is Gerald Mason. I don't believe in letting courage go unnoticed. I'd like to invite you to speak at our annual leadership retreat. Travel, hotel, everything's covered. Say yes." Elena stared at the screen. Her mind raced. Was this real? Was this some kind of prank? But it wasn't. The next day, her manager confirmed that a black car would pick her up that weekend. A room had already been reserved at a luxury resort just outside San Francisco. Gerald Mason didn't just mean what he said. He moved like someone used to changing lives in a single decision. Elena didn't sleep the night before the retreat. What was she supposed to say to a room full of executives, CEOs, and venture capitalists? She had no title, no degree, just a notepad full of customer orders and a head full of dreams she had never dared speak aloud. But when she stood on that stage, small against the backdrop of powerful people, her voice didn't shake. She told them her story. She spoke of growing up in a small apartment with peeling wallpaper and parents who taught her kindness before anything else. Of losing both of them in a car crash when she was 20. Of raising her younger brother, Jaden, while juggling college classes she could barely afford. Of late nights and double shifts. Of the way people looked through her, not at her. And finally, she spoke about that night. About Harold Kensington. About what it felt like to be humiliated and still choose dignity. "I didn't say anything smart," she told them. "I just refused to let someone else decide my value." When she finished, the room didn't erupt with applause. It rose quietly like a tide of respect. People stood, not because she was famous, not because she was polished, but because she reminded them, perhaps for the first time, what real leadership looked like. After her talk, executives lined up to meet her. Some asked for advice. Some admitted, with quiet shame, that they had once spoken to someone in service the way Harold had spoken to her. One woman, a senior VP at a tech company, simply hugged her and said, "Thank you for waking me up." And Gerald? He handed her another card, this one with the name of a prestigious business school printed in gold. "You deserve more than applause," he said. "You deserve a future." The scholarship covered everything. Tuition, books, even a stipend to support her and her brother while she studied full-time. It was more than a chance. It was a doorway, one that had always been locked until now. Elena didn't waste a second. She threw herself into her studies like someone who had waited her whole life for the opportunity. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but professors noticed her. Not for her grades, though those were excellent, but for her insight, for the way she listened first and spoke only when she had something meaningful to say. During a guest lecture one afternoon, a panelist recognized her. "You're the woman from that video, right?" he asked. Elena smiled politely. "Yes." He paused. "You're even more impressive in person." That moment led to her next opportunity, an internship at Gerald's firm, Redwood Capital, the same firm that had invested in Harold's company. She was placed in the strategy department. At first, people underestimated her. A former waitress in the middle of data analysts and Harvard grads. But she didn't just keep up. She stood out. Her first project identified an overlooked trend in community-driven startups. Her report helped secure a $10 million investment that became one of the firm's most successful bets that year. By the time she graduated, the internship turned into a full-time offer. Elena accepted. She didn't forget where she came from. Every Friday, she volunteered at a local youth center, mentoring girls who reminded her of herself, bright, overlooked, underestimated. She talked to them about resilience, about knowing your worth even when others don't, about how one moment can change everything if you meet it with courage. Jaden, her younger brother, thrived too. With Elena's support, he got into a science academy and started dreaming about becoming an aerospace engineer. Their small apartment? They left it behind. Not for a mansion, but for a home with space, light, and a garden Jaden promised to fill with tomatoes and sunflowers. And Harold? His apology came months later, through a statement written by a PR firm. It mentioned regret and misunderstanding and personal growth. But by then, The world had already chosen whose story to believe. Harold's name faded. His companies lost traction. Board members began distancing themselves. Investors, many of whom had seen the video, walked away. But Elena's name? It rose. Not because she chased fame, but because people recognized something rare in her, a strength that didn't scream for attention, but stood tall when it mattered most. People often asked her, what did it feel like, that moment, when you looked him in the eye and said those words? She always smiled and said, I wasn't trying to be brave. I was just tired of pretending I was small. And in that tiredness, she found power. Now, Elena works as a leadership consultant, helping companies rebuild their workplace cultures. Her TED Talk, The Power of Stillness, has been viewed over 10 million times. She still answers her own emails, still returns to the same diner once a month, where the servers now greet her like a hometown legend. But most importantly, she still lives by the belief that changed everything for her. You yelling at me says more about your heart than my worth. And now, she teaches others. When someone tries to break you down, you don't have to shout to stand tall. Sometimes, all it takes is knowing who you are and never letting anyone else define it. The sentence Elena spoke, you yelling at me, says more about your heart than my worth, didn't just echo in that upscale restaurant. It traveled far beyond the marble walls and white tablecloths. A customer at a nearby table had recorded the entire moment on their phone. They didn't plan to go viral. They simply posted the clip on their social media with a caption. This billionaire just humiliated a black waitress, and her one-line reply left him speechless. By midnight, the video had racked up thousands of views. By morning, it had crossed 1 million. And by the end of the week, it was everywhere: Twitter, Instagram, news apps, morning talk shows. People weren't just sharing it, they were talking about it. Writing essays, creating art, repeating that one sentence over and over. You yelling at me says more about your heart than my worth. It became a quote printed on t-shirts, posters, and digital wallpapers. Teachers brought it into classrooms. Therapists used it in sessions. Activists made it their rallying cry. For those who had been silenced, overlooked, or talked down to, it gave them language for their pain. And at the center of it all stood Elena. Not by choice, but by truth. Reporters reached out from every major outlet. CNN, NBC, even international media wanted her voice. Some asked about Harold, wanting scandal and drama. But Elena never spoke to tear anyone down. She didn't rant. She didn't rage. In every interview, she talked about grace, about her parents, about her brother, about the dignity every person deserves, no matter what job they work or what background they come from. And people listened. In the middle of a world where anger often made headlines, her calm cut through the noise like a lighthouse. Meanwhile, Harold Kensington, the billionaire who shouted, belittled, and demanded, faced a different kind of storm. It started small. A few business partners distanced themselves quietly. Then came the headlines. Kensington's outburst sparked backlash. Arrogance exposed in fine dining meltdown. At first, he refused to comment. Then his PR team released a short statement. Mr. Kensington regrets the events that occurred and apologizes for any offense caused. But it was too late. The world had already moved on, from his empire to her example. His investors wanted out. Customers boycotted his brands. Employees inside his companies began leaking stories of similar treatment, shouting, humiliation, impossible standards. Harold didn't lose money right away, but he lost something worse: respect. And that loss echoed in boardrooms, on Wall Street, and across social media, where he became a symbol of the outdated, untouchable elite. Elena, on the other hand, had doors opening every day. Some offered her book deals. Others wanted her to speak on tour. A few even offered her acting roles, thinking she'd want to cash in on her moment. She said no to most of it, because Elena knew her calling wasn't fame, it was impact. She used her sudden platform to start something she'd dreamed about since she was 17, a nonprofit for young women of color. Rise and Lead, launched quietly. Just an online page, a simple mission, and one woman's determination to pay her story forward. But it didn't stay small for long. Mentorships began. Workshops followed. Scholarships were handed out. Young women, some from foster care, others from underfunded schools, started showing up, hungry not just for opportunity, but for belief. And Elena gave them both. She wasn't just a founder. She was there in the classrooms, in the community centers, hosting leadership dinners where high school girls sat next to executives and, for the first time, believed they belonged in those rooms. One of those girls, a shy 15-year-old named Amina, later got accepted into Harvard, and she said it all started with that one sentence. It wasn't just what Elena said, Amina told the press. It was that she didn't let someone else's opinion shrink her. She stood tall, and I saw myself in her. Years passed. Elena never tried to capitalize on the viral fame. She didn't need to. Her work spoke louder. She was invited to speak at the United Nations about workplace dignity. She consulted for companies looking to change their culture. She even returned to the very restaurant where it all began, not as a server, but as a guest of honor for a charity gala. The manager who once defended her stood by her side, smiling proudly. And sitting quietly in the crowd that night was Harold Kensington, a shadow of the man he once was. No cameras were on him. No reporters followed. He wasn't there for publicity. He came because he wanted to see what dignity looked like when it won. He didn't approach Elena. He didn't speak. But as she gave her speech on courage, kindness, and calm in the face of cruelty, he stood up with the rest of the room and clapped. Maybe, in that quiet applause, there was understanding. Maybe even a touch of regret. But Elena wasn't looking for that. Because her victory wasn't proving him wrong. It was becoming something bigger than what he tried to make her feel. Today, Elena still leads Rise and Lead. The organization now reaches thousands of young women each year across the country. She travels often, but always comes home to her brother, Jaden, who's now studying civil engineering and helps run tech for the nonprofit. When people ask her what changed her life, she always says, "It wasn't the insult. It was the moment I refused to accept it as truth." And when they ask what made her brave enough to stand up to a billionaire, she replies simply, "It wasn't bravery. It was self-respect." She never wanted to go viral. She never expected to inspire millions. All she did was choose dignity when it would have been easier to stay silent or fight back in anger. And that choice, it echoed across the world. All because one woman, in one quiet sentence, reminded everyone that power doesn't always come from titles or money. Sometimes it comes from knowing who you are and refusing to be treated as less. And that shocked the world. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.